The sky screamed first. Not thunder, not artillery, just a thin, tearing shriek that turned the air itself into a warning. It was the morning of August 7th, 1944, somewhere south of Caen, where the wheat still smouldered from yesterday's shelling. Oberleutnant Karl Hoffmann sat in his Tiger's commander cupola, scanning the hedgerows through smoke that hung like gauze. The engine idled beneath him, a steady mechanical heartbeat that had carried him across Russia, through Poland, and now into this French hell where every field hid another British gun. The Tiger was invincible. Everyone said so. 100 millimeters of frontal armor, an 88 millimeter cannon that could punch through any Allied tank at 2,000 meters. Inside its steel womb, Hoffmann and his crew of 4 men were gods among mortals, untouchable, supreme. They'd learned to trust the armor like a second skin, to move through battlefields with the casual confidence of men who knew that enemy shells simply bounced away into the dust. Then came that sound again, closer now, a whistling descent that made Hoffmann's gunner, Franz, freeze at his optics. "What is that?" Franz whispered, though his voice carried in the cramped fighting compartment. The driver, Oscar, killed the engine without being told. In the sudden silence, they heard it clearly now, a rushing noise like fabric tearing, multiplied, coming from above. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Hoffmann's training kicked in before his mind could catch up. "Jabbo," he barked, the abbreviated slang for Jagdbomber, fighter bomber. The word alone was enough to send ice through veteran tankers. He slammed the cupola hatch shut, sealing them inside the Tiger's armor. In the dim red glow of the interior lights, 4 faces turned upward, as if they could see through 8 centimeters of steel to whatever circled. Above. The Hawker Typhoon that screamed overhead at that moment belonged to Flight Lieutenant James Thornton of No. 181 Squadron, Royal Air Force. 24 years old, son of a Manchester welder, he'd been flying ground attack sorties over Normandy since the 10th of June. His logbook showed 73 combat missions. His Typhoon, marked with the squadron's distinctive nose art, carried 8 RP-3 rockets, 4 slung beneath each wing on steel rails. Each rocket consisted of a 3-inch diameter steel tube packed with 11 pounds of cordite propellant, topped with a 60-pound semi-armor-piercing warhead containing over 10 pounds of high explosive. From 3,000 feet, Thornton spotted the Tiger immediately. Even partially concealed in a copse of ruined apple trees, its bulk was unmistakable. The German tankers believed their camouflage hid them. They didn't understand that from altitude, thermal exhaust and crushed vegetation created a signature as obvious as a signal flare. Thornton clicked his radio transmitter twice, the signal to his wingman, then pushed the Typhoon's nose down into a diving attack run. The Napier Sabre engine, all 24 cylinders of it, roared as the aircraft accelerated past 400 miles per hour. Wind screamed over the wings. The whole machine vibrated with barely contained violence. Through his reflector gun sight, Thornton centered the Tiger's silhouette. His thumb rested on the rocket firing button. Training had drilled the procedure into his muscle memory. Wait for the range. Not yet. Not yet. Inside the Tiger, Hoffmann heard the engine note change. That distinctive howl of a diving aircraft grew louder, more focused. He'd heard it in Russia when the Sturmovix came low and deadly. This was different, higher pitched, more urgent. The British Jabos were faster than the Soviet ground attack planes, more sophisticated, more frightening in their precision. "Get us moving," Hoffmann ordered. Oscar cranked the starter. The Maybach engine coughed once, twice, then caught with a diesel rumble. But movement took time. The Tiger weighed 54 tons. It didn't leap forward like a light tank. It gathered itself with ponderous deliberation, tracks beginning to churn through the mud that had settled overnight. Thornton's altimeter unwound, 2,000 feet, 1,500. His gloved hand adjusted the trim slightly, compensating for the Typhoon's tendency to pull left in a dive. The Tiger grew larger in his sight. He could see it moving now, trying to escape. The German crew had finally realized their danger. Too late. At 1,000 feet, with the aircraft diving at over 450 miles per hour, Thornton's training said fire. His thumb pressed the button. The rockets launched in pairs, a salvo of 8 60-pound projectiles leaving their rails with a whoosh of ignited cordite. Each rocket accelerated to 260 meters per second in the first 2 seconds of flight. They didn't fly perfectly straight. The unguided nature of the RP-3 meant dispersion was inevitable. But at this range, with this target, volume mattered more than pinpoint accuracy. Hoffman never saw them coming. The first indication that anything had changed was the sound, a shrieking series of impacts that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The Tiger's armor, invincible against tank guns, rang like a cathedral bell struck by a sledgehammer. One rocket hit the glacis plate head-on, its 60-pound warhead detonating with a flash that momentarily blinded Franz through his gunsight optics. The explosion didn't penetrate. The Tiger's frontal armor was too thick for that, but the concussive force transmitted through the steel like a shockwave through water. 2 more rockets struck the turret. One exploded against the gun mantlet, showering the area with molten metal fragments. The other hit the turret ring, that mechanical junction where the rotating turret met the hull. The explosion jammed the traverse mechanism. Inside, the turret gunner spun his controls frantically. Nothing. The turret was frozen, unable to rotate, unable to bring the main gun to bear on any target. But it was the 4th rocket that changed everything. Thornton's aim, honed through 73 combat missions, had placed one rocket perfectly. It struck the Tiger's engine deck at a shallow angle, the semi-armor-piercing warhead punching through the thinner rear armor before detonating inside the engine compartment. Burning rocket propellant mixed with diesel fuel. The Maybach engine, that reliable German workhorse, seized instantly. Smoke began pouring from the engine grills, thick, black choking smoke that carried the stench of burning rubber and overheated metal. Hoffman didn't need to give the order. His crew knew. Fire in the engine meant fire spreading to the fuel tanks. Fire in the fuel tanks meant death. Oscar already had his hatch open. Franz abandoned his gun sight and scrambled toward the loader's hatch. The loader himself, a 19-year-old named Dieter who'd joined them only 3 weeks ago, froze. His hands gripped the base of the 88mm shell he'd been loading. His eyes were wide, uncomprehending. "Move!" Hoffman shouted. His voice cracked with the urgency of a man who'd seen tigers brew up in Russia. He grabbed Dieter by the collar and physically hauled him toward the turret hatch. Smoke was filling the interior now, acrid and thick. The red interior lights flickered once, twice, then died as the electrical system failed. Outside, Thornton pulled his Typhoon out of the dive, feeling the G-forces press him into his seat. His altimeter showed 500 feet. Too low, dangerously low. But he'd needed that precision to place his rockets accurately. As the aircraft climbed away, he glanced back. The Tiger was burning. Good hit. One more German tank out of the war. But Thornton didn't see the men. He didn't see Hoffman and his crew, tumbling from their hatches, coughing, faces blackened with smoke. He didn't see them running from the burning tank, stumbling through the mud toward the tree line. He didn't see Dieter collapse after 20 meters, his lungs seared from inhaling superheated smoke. He didn't see Franz drop to his knees beside the boy, trying to help, failing. From 3,000 feet, banking away toward the rally point, all Thornton saw was smoke. Confirmation. Another successful sortie. He'd write it in his logbook that evening. Tiger tank destroyed near Cayenne. 8 rockets expended. No opposition. The reality on the ground told a different story. Hoffman crouched in a ditch 200 meters from his burning Tiger, watching 54 tons of German engineering superiority transform into a funeral pyre. The turret ammunition began cooking off, sending secondary explosions rattling through the hull. Each detonation threw sparks and debris into the morning sky. Franz held Dieter's head in his lap, whispering the Lord's Prayer in a voice that wouldn't stop shaking. Hoffman had believed in the Tiger. They all had. The propaganda said it was invincible. The armor specifications proved it. The combat record demonstrated it. One Tiger could hold off an entire British tank platoon. But no one had told them about the aircraft. No one had explained that invincibility had a ceiling, a literal altitude above which armor meant nothing, where speed and altitude transformed a fighter plane into something more deadly than any tank. The Luftwaffe was supposed to protect them, that's what the officers said. German air superiority would shield the Panzers from enemy aircraft. But Hoffmann hadn't seen a German fighter plane in 3 weeks. The sky belonged to the RAF now. The Typhoons owned the daylight hours, circling in what the British called cab ranks, ready to dive on any German armour that dared move in the open. A second Typhoon screamed overhead, lower this time, its pilot attracted by the Lollerjäger. Smoke from Hoffmann's burning tank. No rockets this time, just a long burst from the aircraft's 4 20mm cannons. Shells tore through the orchard, chewing through tree trunks, kicking up fountains of dirt. Hoffmann pressed himself into the mud, making himself as small as possible. The firing pass lasted 3 seconds. It felt like an hour. When the engine noise faded, Hoffmann lifted his head. The orchard looked like a sawmill had exploded, trees reduced to splinters, branches scattered like kindling, and somewhere in that devastation, Oscar wasn't moving. The driver lay where the cannon shells had found him, one hand still outstretched toward cover he'd never reached. 3 men left, 3 out of 5, and their Tiger, their invincible, impenetrable Tiger, was scrap metal. Hoffmann's hands were shaking, not from fear, he told himself, from rage, from the fundamental unfairness of dying to something you couldn't even shoot back at. The Tiger's 88 could destroy any enemy tank, but it couldn't elevate high enough to engage an aircraft. The defensive machine gun was useless against a target moving at 400 miles per hour. They'd been helpless, completely, utterly helpless. The morning sun broke through the smoke. In the distance, Hoffmann heard the rumble of other Tigers, his company commander's tank probably, moving up to support. He should try to reach them. He should report what happened. But first he had to stand. He had to leave Oscar and Dieter in this field. He had to keep moving. Survival meant abandoning the dead and carrying the memory of how inadequate they'd all been. Franz appeared beside him, materializing from the smoke like a ghost. His face was streaked with tears and soot. "Dieter?" Hoffmann asked, though he already knew. Franz just shook his head. They stood together in the ruined orchard, 2 survivors of a weapon system that was supposed to be invincible, learning the hard lesson that every military innovation eventually meets its counter. For the Tiger tank, that counter screamed through the sky at 400 miles per hour, carrying 60-pound warheads that cared nothing for armor thickness or German engineering pride. Above them, another pair of Typhoons circled, patient, methodical, waiting for the next target to reveal itself. The road from Villers-Bocage to Caen had become a graveyard of German armor. Every kilometre revealed another burned-out hulk, another Tiger or Panther reduced to smoking scrap by British rockets. Hoffmann walked that road 3 days after losing his tank. He'd been ordered to join the replacement crew pool at the regimental headquarters. Around him, other survivors moved with the same hollow-eyed exhaustion. They didn't speak much. There wasn't much to say. The Tiger had been Germany's answer to Allied material superiority. When it rolled into combat in Tunisia during 1942, it revolutionized armored warfare. Its 88mm gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges where return fire was impossible. Its armor shrugged off hits that would cripple lesser vehicles. In early engagements, British tank crews reported shells simply bouncing off the Tiger's glacis plate, arcing away into the sky like skipped stones. The Tiger carried 5 crew members: commander, gunner, loader, driver, radio operator. Each man trained for months to operate his station with mechanical precision. The commander orchestrated the ballet of movement and fire. The gunner's eye and the loader's rhythm determined rate of fire. The driver nursed the temperamental transmission through terrain that wanted to trap or disable. The radio operator maintained contact with the company, the lifeline that kept armor fighting as coordinated force rather than isolated targets. But all that training, all that mechanical sophistication, assumed combat would happen on the ground. The Tiger's designers had optimized for tank versus tank engagements. They'd built a fortress on tracks, a mobile gun platform that could dominate any terrestrial battlefield. No one had seriously considered aerial attack. The assumption was simple: German air superiority would keep enemy aircraft away from the Panzer formations. The Luftwaffe would shield the tanks. That assumption died in Normandy. By August of 1944, the Luftwaffe barely existed as a fighting force in France. Allied air superiority was so complete that German pilots called daylight operations suicide missions. The few Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters that ventured near the battlefield were outnumbered 10-1. Most never made it back to their airfields. The sky belonged entirely to the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces. Into that empty sky came the Typhoon squadrons, 26 of them by mid-1944, all operating with the 2nd Tactical Air Force. The organization was simple and devastatingly effective. Typhoons flew in cab-rank formations, circling above the battlefield at 10,000 feet like taxicabs waiting for fares. When Allied ground forces radioed for air support, a flight of Typhoons would peel off and dive onto the target within minutes. The response time was measured in seconds. There was no escape, no warning, just sudden death from above. The RP-3 rocket that armed these Typhoons was Britain's attempt to give fighter aircraft tank-killing capability. Development had begun during the North Africa campaign, when British forces needed weapons to counter German armour in the desert. The early versions used 25-pound armour-piercing warheads. These proved ineffective against heavy tanks like the Tiger. So British engineers scaled up. The 60-pound semi-armour-piercing warhead that emerged could crack thick armour through sheer kinetic energy and explosive force. Each rocket consisted of a 3-inch diameter steel tube. Inside, 11 pounds of cordite propellant provided thrust. 4 large tail fins stabilized the rocket in flight, inducing enough spin to maintain directional stability. The warhead screwed onto the front, a 6-inch diameter projectile filled with explosives. The complete assembly weighed approximately 65 pounds. A Typhoon carrying 8 rockets added over 500 pounds to its combat weight, but the trade-off was worth it. 8 rockets delivered as much explosive force as a naval destroyer's broadside. The firing mechanism was electrical. A pigtail lead connected the rocket to the aircraft's firing circuit. When the pilot pressed the button, current flowed through the pigtail and ignited the cordite charge. The rocket launched from its rail with minimal recoil, the thrust vector aligned with the aircraft's center line to prevent yaw. Launch rails under each wing could accommodate 4 rockets in a single line. Later in the war, some squadrons doubled up the rails to carry 16 rockets, though this configuration was rare due to weight and drag penalties. Accuracy was the rocket's Achilles heel. Unlike a gun-fired shell, the RP-3 had no rifling to stabilize its flight. The 4 fins induced spin, but not enough to eliminate dispersion. At typical firing ranges of 1,500 to 2,000 yards, a spread of several meters was normal. This meant hitting a specific point on a tank, like a vision slit or a weak spot in the armor, was nearly impossible. But hitting the tank somewhere was highly probable when firing 8 rockets in a salvo. Pilots learned to compensate through technique rather than precision. The standard attack profile involved diving from altitude at an angle between 30 and 45 degrees. This steep dive did several things. It increased the aircraft's speed, making it harder for anti-aircraft fire to track. It improved the rocket's trajectory, giving them a more direct path to the target. And it reduced the firing range, tightening the dispersion pattern. The dive also terrified the target. A Typhoon, in its attack dive, was pure predator, screaming down from the sky with engine howling and rockets visible under the wings. German tankers learned to recognize that sound, the tearing shriek of a Napier Sabre engine at full power mixed with the whistling of air over the rocket fins. It was a sound that meant death was coming and there was nothing you could do about it. Ground-based anti-aircraft fire was the Typhoon's primary threat. German flak guns, especially the deadly 37mm and 88mm weapons, could shred aircraft at low altitude. Pilots had to judge their attack carefully. Dive too early, and you'd be in the flak zone too long. Wait too long, and you'd lose the surprise advantage. The best pilots developed an instinct for timing, diving when the target was most vulnerable and pulling out before the flak batteries could track effectively. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But even good pilots died. The 2nd Tactical Air Force lost 829 aircraft during the Normandy campaign. Most were Typhoons shot down during low-level attacks. The casualty rate was horrific, worse than bomber crews faced over Germany. Every time a pilot pushed over into an attack dive, he knew there was a real chance he wouldn't pull out. The bravery required to do that mission after mission, day after day, was something Hoffman would never have acknowledged aloud but understood in his bones. The psychological impact of the Typhoon attacks went beyond the physical damage. A Tiger tank was more than steel and mechanics. It was a symbol. It represented German technological superiority, the idea that Germanic engineering and precision could overcome Allied numerical advantages. Propaganda films showed Tigers crushing enemy tanks, dominating battlefields, carrying victory through sheer invincibility. Tankers like Hoffman were told they were the elite, the armoured knights of the modern age. Then came the Typhoons, and that myth shattered. Suddenly, invincibility had a ceiling. The armour that shrugged off tank shells meant nothing against a 60-pound warhead dropped from above. The mighty 88mm cannon couldn't elevate high enough to fight back. All the training, all the mechanical sophistication, all the confidence built through victory after victory, evaporated in the face of an enemy that struck from a dimension the tank couldn't contest. Survivors reported a peculiar helplessness. Inside the Tiger, you were protected from infantry, from tank shells, from almost any ground-based threat. But against aircraft, you were trapped. You couldn't run. The Tiger was too slow. You couldn't hide. The exhaust signature gave you away. You couldn't shoot back effectively. All you could do was button up the hatches and pray the rockets missed, or that your armour would hold. The armour didn't always hold. The 60-pound semi-armour-piercing warhead could penetrate up to 198mm of armour under ideal conditions. The Tiger's frontal armour was 100mm thick, theoretically proof against the RP-3, but rockets rarely hit at ideal angles. They struck turret rings, engine decks, tracks, the thinner side and rear armour, and even when they didn't penetrate, the explosive force caused spalling. Fragments of the inner armour surface would break off and ricochet through the crew compartment at lethal velocity. More often, the rockets didn't need to penetrate to kill the tank. A hit on the engine deck could destroy the power plant. A hit on the turret ring could jam the traverse. A hit on the tracks could immobilize the vehicle. Once immobilized, the Tiger became a stationary target for follow-up attacks. Sometimes the crew would abandon a damaged but repairable tank simply because staying inside it invited more rocket strikes. The morale effect rippled through entire formations. Company commanders reported crews becoming increasingly reluctant to move during daylight hours. Tigers that should have been supporting infantry advances stayed concealed in tree lines. Tank platoons that should have counterattacked British breakthroughs hesitated, waiting for nightfall when the Typhoons couldn't operate. The weapon system designed to dominate the battlefield was being dominated by fear of what circled above. German Tiger crews never saw Typhoon rockets. Until 60 pounds, Warheads hit. From 1,000 yards, Part 2, Hoffman's replacement Tiger arrived on August 20th. The machine looked identical to the one he'd lost, but everything felt different now. The crew that assembled around it, Franz among them, moved with cautious tension rather than the confidence that had once defined Panzer operations. They checked the hatches obsessively. They scanned the sky constantly. The invincibility they'd once felt had been replaced by something closer to permanent vigilance. The new tank bore the number 307 painted in white across its turret. Fresh from the factory at Kassel, it had never seen combat. Its interior still smelled of new paint and machine oil. But Hoffman knew that pristine mechanical condition meant nothing against an enemy that attacked from above. The Tiger's armour, its sophisticated engineering, its powerful gun, all became irrelevant when the Typhoons circled overhead like birds of prey. The RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force had perfected a system that transformed air power into a constant psychological weapon. 26 Typhoon squadrons operated in cab-rank formations throughout the Normandy campaign. The concept was simple but devastating. Flights of 4 Typhoons would orbit above the battlefield at altitudes between 8,000 and 12,000 feet, waiting for ground controllers to call them down onto targets. Response time measured in minutes. From a German tanker's perspective, the sky was never empty. Even when you couldn't see them, you knew they were there. The cab rank system meant that Allied infantry units could summon devastating airstrikes with radio calls. Forward air controllers, RAF officers embedded with British Army units, travelled in radio-equipped vehicles close to the front lines. When they identified a target, German armour, fortified positions, artillery concentrations, they would transmit coordinates. Within 5 minutes, Typhoons would be diving out of the clouds with rockets and cannons blazing. The system created a tactical flexibility that German doctrine had never anticipated. For the Tiger crews, this meant that movement during daylight hours became suicidal. Hoffmann's orders on August 21st emphasized this new reality. All tank movements restricted to nighttime, daylight operations authorized only in cases of direct enemy breakthrough. Camouflage discipline absolute priority. The Tigers, designed to dominate battlefields through mobile firepower, were being reduced to stationary pillboxes hidden under trees and camouflage netting. The psychological toll accumulated slowly. Veteran tankers who'd fought across Russia without breaking began showing signs of combat fatigue. Some developed a condition the medical officers called flak shock, a nervous disorder triggered by constant exposure to air attack. The symptoms were distinctive: hypervigilance, inability to sleep, violent reactions to sudden noises, an obsessive need to keep one hand on an escape hatch whenever inside the tank. Franz showed the signs first. Hoffmann noticed him flinching at the sound of distant aircraft engines, even when the planes were clearly Allied bombers heading inland at high altitude. The gunners' hands trembled slightly when loading shells. During their third night movement, Franz froze completely when a British reconnaissance aircraft passed overhead, its engine drone barely audible over the Tiger's own mechanical noise. It took Hoffmann several minutes to talk him back to functional awareness. The truth about Typhoon effectiveness remained obscured by perception and fear. Post-battle analysis would later reveal that actual tank kills by rocket-firing aircraft were far lower than RAF pilot claims suggested. During Operation Goodwood in mid-July, Typhoon pilots claimed 222 tanks destroyed. British research units that examined the battlefield afterward attributed only 10 German tank losses to rocket strikes. The disparity between claimed and actual kills was enormous, a statistical illusion created by combat, chaos, and pilot overconfidence. But the psychological impact had nothing to do with actual casualty rates. The German tankers didn't know that Typhoon rockets rarely penetrated Tiger armor. They didn't know that most damaged tanks were repairable. What they knew was the sound of aircraft engines overhead, the shriek of incoming rockets, the helplessness of being unable to fight back effectively. Fear multiplied the weapon's effectiveness far beyond its actual lethality. Hoffmann understood this intellectually but couldn't escape it emotionally. On the morning of August 23rd, his company received orders to support an infantry counterattack near the town of Bourgebus. The operation required daylight movement across open ground. Every tanker in the formation knew what that meant: exposure, vulnerability, death from above. They moved out at 0700 hours, 6 Tigers advancing in line through wheat fields that offered minimal concealment. The morning was clear, visibility unlimited, perfect flying weather. Hoffmann kept his cupola hatch open despite standing orders, unwilling to trap himself inside the steel hull. His eyes swept the sky constantly, searching for the silhouettes that meant danger. The Typhoons found them at 0723. Hoffmann heard them before he saw them, that distinctive howl of Napier Sabre engines diving at combat power. 4 aircraft in loose formation, dropping from 10,000 feet at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. He had perhaps 15 seconds before they reached firing range. "Button up," he ordered over the intercom. The command was unnecessary. Franz had already sealed his hatch. The driver pulled his protective cover closed. The loader crouched low inside the turret, pressing himself against the ammunition racks. Hoffman dropped into the cupola and slammed the hatch above his head, sealing them in darkness broken only by the red glow of the interior lights. The first indication of the attack was sound, a series of whooshing noises, barely audible over the Tiger's engine, followed immediately by impacts that rang through the hull like hammer blows. Hoffman felt each hit through his bones, the concussive force transmitted through steel and air. One rocket struck the glacis plate directly ahead of the driver's position. The explosion was deafening inside the closed compartment. Franz screamed. Not words, just a raw sound of terror that echoed in the confined space. The loader dropped to the floor, hands over his head. Hoffman gripped his periscope handles, trying to see through the smoke and dust that suddenly filled his vision. The Tiger was still moving, the engine still running. They were alive. A second salvo struck seconds later. This time multiple rockets hit almost simultaneously. One exploded against the turret side, the blast creating a sound like the inside of a bell tower during mass. Another struck the track assembly on the left side, the explosion showering the hull with dirt and fragments. The third rocket hit the rear deck at a shallow angle, its warhead punching through the thinner armor before detonating inside the engine compartment. Hoffman knew that sound. Fire in the engine. He'd heard it 3 weeks ago in the orchard. The same mechanical shriek of tortured metal. The same acrid smell of burning fuel and rubber seeping through the ventilation system. This time he didn't hesitate. "Out!" he shouted. "Everybody out! Now!" The crew moved with practiced speed born from recent experience. Franz had his hatch open and was halfway through before Hoffman finished speaking. The loader followed, moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone operating on pure survival instinct. Hoffman pulled himself through the cupola hatch as smoke began pouring from the engine grills behind him. He dropped to the ground and ran. No thought, no tactical assessment, just movement away from the burning Tiger. Behind him, secondary explosions began as ammunition heated beyond its tolerance. Each detonation threw sparks and debris into the morning sky. Franz and the loader were already in a drainage ditch 30 meters away. The driver appeared moments later, his face blackened with smoke, coughing so hard he could barely stand. Hoffman counted heads, 4 present, 1 missing, the radio operator. He turned back toward the Tiger. The tank was fully engulfed now, flames pouring from every hatch and vision port. No one could survive inside that inferno. He'd lost another crewman, another 19-year-old who'd believed the propaganda about German engineering superiority. The Typhoons made a second pass, lower this time, their 20mm cannons strafing the burning Tiger and the wheat field around it. Hoffman pressed himself into the mud as shells tore through the air inches above his head. The sound was physical, a series of sharp cracks that seemed to split the air itself. Then the aircraft were gone, climbing away toward their rally point to report another successful tank kill. Hoffman lay in the ditch for 5 minutes after the engine noise faded. Around him, his surviving crew did the same. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They'd been found, targeted, and destroyed in less than 2 minutes. All the training, all the mechanical sophistication of the Tiger, all the tactical doctrine developed through years of combat, meant nothing against an enemy that struck from a dimension they couldn't contest. By the time Hoffman and his survivors reached friendly lines that evening, the reality of the situation had crystallized. The Tiger tank, Germany's technological answer to Allied numerical superiority, had become obsolete, not through better enemy tanks, but through air power. The weapon system designed to dominate ground combat was being dominated by aircraft it couldn't effectively engage. The numbers told part of the story. During the Normandy campaign, Germany lost approximately 100 tanks to direct air attack out of 1,500 total tank losses, a small percentage measured statistically. But those numbers didn't account for the tanks abandoned by crews who panicked under air attack. They didn't measure the Tigers that sat immobile under camouflage all day, unable to support infantry operations because movement meant death. They didn't quantify the combat effectiveness lost to fear and psychological trauma. Hoffman witnessed this erosion of combat capability throughout late August. Tank platoons that should have counterattacked British breakthroughs hesitated, waiting for darkness that came too late. Experienced Panzer commanders refused to move their vehicles during daylight regardless of tactical necessity. Entire companies sat paralyzed in tree lines while Allied forces advanced unopposed through open ground. The cab rank system's true effectiveness lay in this paralysis. Even when Typhoons weren't actively attacking, their presence overhead meant German armor couldn't maneuver. The mere possibility of air attack achieved what actual strikes never could: complete suppression of German armored mobility during daylight hours. British and Canadian forces learned to time their ground attacks for midday, when Typhoon coverage was heaviest and German tanks were least likely to respond effectively. By early September, as Allied forces broke out of Normandy and began the race across France, Hoffman had survived 4 Typhoon attacks. He'd lost 2 Tigers, 5 crewmen, and most of the confidence that had once defined his professional identity. The man who'd believed in German technological supremacy had been reduced to someone who scanned the sky obsessively and flinched at the sound of aircraft engines. The final irony arrived with the intelligence reports that filtered down from division headquarters. British research teams examining destroyed German tanks in the Normandy battlefield found that most Tiger losses couldn't be attributed to airstrikes. The majority had been destroyed by anti-tank guns or abandoned by crews when mechanical failures made them inoperable. The Typhoon's reputation as a tank killer was largely psychological rather than material, but that revelation came too late for the men who'd died in burning Tigers, too late for the crews who'd abandoned functional tanks because they believed air attack meant certain death, too late for veteran tankers like Franz, who'd developed combat fatigue from constant exposure to airstrikes, both real and imagined. The psychological weapon had already achieved its purpose. Hoffman received his 3rd Tiger on September 9th, in a depot far behind the front lines where the Normandy battlefield had become distant memory. The war was moving east now, back toward Germany. The Allies were advancing on multiple fronts. The Reich's strategic situation was deteriorating daily, but Hoffman found himself unable to care much about grand strategy. His world had narrowed to immediate concerns: sky conditions, cloud cover. The next time aircraft engines might appear overhead, the new crew they assigned him were boys barely old enough to shave, replacements drawn from training units that had compressed months of instruction into weeks. They looked at Hoffman with the mixture of respect and fear that veterans inspired. He was 28 years old. He felt 60. Every day under the open sky aged him in ways that had nothing to do with calendar time. Their first training exercise involved basic movement drills. Hoffman watched his young driver struggle with the Tiger's complex transmission, grinding gears and lurching through turns. The gunner couldn't estimate range properly. The loader fumbled with shells. They were unprepared for actual combat, thrust into operational units because Germany's replacement pool was exhausted. During the afternoon session, a flight of Allied fighters passed overhead at high altitude, probably P-51 Mustangs heading east on bomber escort duty. No threat to ground forces. But Hoffman's new crew reacted with panic that bordered on comedy. The driver killed the engine. The gunner traversed the turret wildly, trying to track aircraft that were already miles away. The loader dropped the practice shell he'd been handling. Hoffman didn't reprimand them. How could he? Their fear was justified. Logical, even. The sky had become the enemy, and they were right to fear it. Instead, he gathered them together after the exercise and attempted to explain what he'd learned through experience purchased with other men's lives. "Listen carefully," he said. His voice carried the flat precision of someone teaching survival techniques rather than military tactics. "The Jabos will find you if you move during daylight. Camouflage helps but isn't perfect. Your engine exhaust marks your position better than any flag. When they dive, you have perhaps 20 seconds. That's how long it takes from first engine sound to rocket impact." The young faces stared at him with wide-eyed attention. He continued, "You won't see the rockets coming. They're too fast, and your vision is too limited through the periscopes. What you'll feel is the impact, like being inside a bell that someone's striking with a sledgehammer. If the rockets hit the armor, you might survive. If they hit the engine or tracks, you need to evacuate immediately. Fire spreads in seconds. One of the boys, the gunner, raised a trembling hand. Herr Oberleutnant, how do we fight back? Hoffmann felt something bitter rise in his throat. You don't, he said simply. The Tiger's machine guns can't track fast enough. The main gun can't elevate high enough. Your only defense is to not be seen in the first place. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a burning tank. These were the elite Panzer forces, the armoured spearhead of the Wehrmacht, the technological pinnacle of German military engineering, and their primary tactical doctrine against enemy aircraft was hiding and hoping. That evening, Hoffmann wrote a letter to Hans Kleiner's mother in Bavaria. He'd been delaying this task for months, unable to find words adequate to explain how her son had died. Not in glorious combat against enemy tanks, not defending the fatherland against superior numbers, but trapped in a mechanically failed Tiger that became his crematorium because German engineering prioritized theoretical sophistication over battlefield reliability. He wrote about Hans's mechanical aptitude, his dedication to gunnery training, his excitement about the apple harvest back home. He didn't write about the smell of burning flesh or the sounds of ammunition cooking off, or the way Hans's screams had echoed over the radio before the frequency went dead. Those details belonged to Hoffmann's nightmares, not to a grieving mother's memories. The Typhoon's true legacy wasn't measured in destroyed tanks, but in transformed doctrine. By late 1944, German armoured operations had fundamentally changed. Night movements became standard. Daylight advances occurred only under heavy cloud cover. Tank platoons operated in small, dispersed groups rather than concentrated formations. The entire tactical philosophy that had carried Germany to victory in Poland and France had been inverted by the simple presence of enemy aircraft overhead. This transformation represented something more profound than battlefield adaptation. It marked the end of an era when tanks dominated ground warfare through technical superiority alone. The Tiger had been designed to answer a specific tactical problem: how to destroy enemy tanks at maximum range while remaining invulnerable to return fire. It solved that problem brilliantly. But the problem changed. Combat evolved beyond the two-dimensional chess game of tank versus tank into something three-dimensional, where air power redefined the rules entirely. Hoffmann's generation of tankers had been trained in the old paradigm. They'd learned gunnery techniques and armour tactics and mechanical maintenance. They'd studied battles where victory came through superior positioning and firepower. Nothing in their training prepared them for an enemy that attacked from above, at speeds their gun traverse couldn't match, from ranges their weapons couldn't reach. The Americans and British had recognized this reality earlier than Germany. Their tank development emphasized mobility and reliability over armor thickness. Their tactical doctrine integrated air and ground operations from the beginning. The cab rank system, the forward air controllers, the radio coordination between aircraft and infantry, all represented a holistic approach to combined arms warfare that Germany had failed to develop. By October, as Hoffmann's company retreated through Belgium toward the German border, the strategic situation had become desperate. Allied forces were advancing on all fronts. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. German tank production, never matching Allied output, had been further degraded by strategic bombing. The replacement crews arriving at the front were increasingly young, increasingly undertrained, increasingly unsurvivable. Hoffmann found himself training boys who should have been finishing school. 16-year-olds pulled from Hitler Youth programs and given 3 weeks of instruction before being thrust into Tiger commander positions. They had enthusiasm but no judgment, courage but no experience. They died quickly, usually within their first week of operations, killed by tactical mistakes that veterans would never make. The worst part was how preventable most of these deaths were. A boy who exposed himself in the cupola hatch to get better visibility. A crew that moved during daylight because they didn't understand the aircraft threat. A driver who didn't recognize engine sounds that indicated imminent mechanical failure. Each death represented a failure of training, of doctrine, of the system that had placed untrained children in sophisticated war machines. Hoffmann tried to keep his crews alive through obsessive instruction. He taught them to read the sky, to identify aircraft types by sound alone, to recognize the precise moment when movement became suicide. He showed them how to camouflage a Tiger so its thermal signature didn't betray its position. He drilled them on evacuation procedures until they could abandon a burning tank in under 10 seconds. Some of them learned, most didn't live long enough for the lessons to matter. By November, Hoffman had trained and lost 3 complete crews. He stopped learning their names. The emotional distance was self-preservation, a psychological adaptation to ongoing trauma that would have destroyed him otherwise. They became the driver, the gunner, the loader, functional roles rather than human beings. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The war ended for Hoffman on December 3, 1944, not through death but through injury. A Typhoon attack near Aachen caught his Tiger in open ground. The rocket strike didn't penetrate, but the concussive force ruptured his eardrums and caused internal bleeding. He spent the next 2 months in a field hospital, deaf and semi-conscious, while the war continued without him. When he finally recovered enough to understand what was happening, it was February of 1945. The Reich was collapsing. Allied forces were crossing the Rhine. Berlin was burning under Soviet artillery. The Tiger tanks that had once represented German military supremacy were being abandoned by the hundreds, left in fields and forests across Europe. Not destroyed in combat, but simply immobilized by lack of fuel or spare parts or trained crews to operate them. Hoffman never returned to tank operations. His hearing never fully recovered. He was reassigned to a training depot in Bavaria, where he taught basic gunnery to boys who would never see combat, because the war ended before they finished instruction. When the Americans arrived in late April, he surrendered his pistol to a sergeant who looked about 16 years old. The irony wasn't lost on him. In the decades after the war, Hoffman never talked about his experiences. The questions civilians asked: did you kill many enemy tanks? Were you ever afraid? Did you believe in the cause? Seemed to come from a different universe than the one he'd inhabited. How could you explain to someone who'd never been there that the worst enemy wasn't the Allied tanks, but the sound of aircraft engines overhead? That the Tiger's invincibility was a myth shattered by 60-pound warheads fired from ranges the tank couldn't contest? He learned eventually that the Typhoon's effectiveness had been more psychological than material. That actual tank kills by air-launched rockets were statistically small. That most German tank losses in Normandy came from other causes. But that knowledge changed nothing. The fear had been real. The helplessness had been real. The deaths of his crewmen had been real. The trauma didn't care about statistical analysis or post-battle research studies. Franz survived the war but never recovered psychologically. Hoffman heard through veterans' networks that his former gunner had spent years in psychiatric treatment for what doctors called combat neurosis. The precise, methodical man who'd once loaded 88mm shells with mechanical efficiency couldn't hold a job or maintain relationships. The Typhoons had broken something fundamental inside him that peacetime couldn't repair. Hoffman often thought about the fundamental irony of it all. The Tiger had been designed to restore German military dominance through superior technology. It succeeded brilliantly at its intended purpose, destroying enemy tanks at ranges they couldn't match. But success at the designed mission didn't matter when the nature of combat changed underneath you. The three-dimensional battlefield, where air power dominated ground forces, regardless of armor thickness, represented a paradigm the Tiger couldn't address. The lesson should have been obvious to the German High Command, but wasn't. When you design a weapon system to solve yesterday's problem, you risk being obsolete before production even begins. The Tiger answered the question of how to defeat enemy tanks, but by 1944, that wasn't the question that mattered. The real question was how to operate armoured forces under conditions of complete enemy air superiority. Germany never developed a satisfactory answer. Standing in his small apartment in Munich during the 1960s, Hoffman would sometimes hear aircraft passing overhead. Commercial jets at high altitude, completely harmless, but the sound would trigger something primitive in his nervous system. His hands would start shaking. His breath would catch. For a few seconds, he'd be back in the Tiger's commander cupola, waiting for the shriek of incoming rockets, knowing his armor meant nothing against the enemy overhead. The psychological scars never fully healed. Neither did the knowledge that all the training, all the mechanical sophistication, all the faith in German engineering superiority had been inadequate against an enemy that fought in 3 dimensions while Germany remained trapped in 2. The Tiger had been a magnificent weapon, but magnificence without adaptability is just an expensive vulnerability. History would remember the Tiger tank as a symbol of German engineering prowess. Military historians would analyze its combat record, its technical specifications, its tactical employment, but for the men who'd crewed them, who'd died in them, who'd survived them scarred and traumatized, the Tiger represented something simpler and sadder. It was a monument to the limits of technological solutions when the fundamental nature of warfare changes faster than doctrine can adapt. Hoffmann died in 1976. Natural causes, the doctors said, but Franz, attending the funeral, knew better. His old commander had died in August of 1944 in a burning Tiger under Typhoon attack. The body just took 32 more years to acknowledge what the spirit had known all along. Some wounds don't heal, some fears don't fade, some lessons cost more than anyone should have to pay. The sky above Munich was clear that day. Not a cloud in sight. Perfect flying weather. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.